Matt, once again, good morning.
Good morning to you, Trishanjali.
Okay, I think we have most of the people who registered. Let's begin the webinar now. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of our sustainability webinar series. And before we begin, let me start with a short story of how and why I started this series. So a couple of months back, I started my journey into sustainability and ESG. And I started it with a newsletter. And the purpose of that newsletter was to learn new topics in sustainability and share it with the world. So with the same intention today, I decided to launch this series of expert talks to learn and share the very interesting and yet complex topics of ESG and sustainability. So throughout this series of webinar, I will be inviting experts to share their insights and expertise on various aspects of ESG and sustainability. And as we all know, ESG encompasses a wide range of topics that are both complex and constantly evolving. And so to navigate these changes and challenges in sustainability, continuous learning and networking are very essential. And with that in mind, we're kicking off our series with one of the most crucial and talked about topics in ESG, which is climate risk. And to shed light on this subject, we have a very special guest, Matt Macunas, the co-founder and of Weather Trade Net. And let me give you a brief introduction to Matt before we start. He is a seasoned sustainability expert who collaborates with early stage tech startups, particularly in the fields of climate and sustainability, guiding them throughout the uncertainties of climate change. In addition to his role at Weather TradeNet, Matt advises 5 other startups, mentors emerging entrepreneurs, and serves as a brand ambassador of startup accelerators. In his previous role, Matt has been a trailblazer promoting electric vehicle adoption and voluntary carbon credit markets. He has led political and grassroots campaign and is a founder and contributing writer at Clean Energy Revolution. Furthermore, Matt was a longtime specialist for the First State Green Bank in the US, where he focused on policy, outreach, regulation, and legislation. Let me just tell you briefly about Weather TradeNet, the company of which Matt is a co-founder. Weather TradeNet is at the forefront of climate risk analytics. It provides powerful tools that help businesses understand the risk posed to their properties by climate change and extreme weather events. Their unique technology allows companies to quickly and easily assess these climatic risks on their own without having to wait for external reports. This means businesses can take immediate action to protect their assets and comply with new sustainability regulations. In short, Weather TradeNet empowers your business with the knowledge you need to safeguard your future assets against climate change challenges. So before we begin this webinar, a few housekeeping rules for all the attendees. It would be a 60 minutes long webinar where for the first 45 minutes or so, I will ask Matt to share his experiences and expertise in sustainability, particularly around climate risk. And then we will open the floor for any questions from the audience who can choose to leave. So you can choose to leave your questions in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself or ask me to unmute you to ask directly your question to Matt. So, Matt, we are honored to have you today with us to kick off this series and to share your invaluable expertise on climate risk. And with that introduction, please join me in welcoming Matt today. Thank you for joining, Matt. And I hope I did justice to your, diverse and extensive introduction. And why don't you tell us more about your journey in climate and sustainability? How did it all begin for you?
So you honor me, Tritanjali. Thanks so much for the invite. Appreciate it. And hello, everyone from the U.S. East Coast. So I guess sustainability's always kind of been a little bit baked into my DNA. One of my favorite stories from my parents is how I would try to shame them when I was, I don't know, maybe 10 years old. Like, why are you still using styrofoam? Why are you not composting? Those sorts of questions that would really be focused on sustainable or eco-centric lifestyle. I grew up with a natural gravitation toward that. It just seemed to make sense. Like, why wouldn't society want to act in a sort of symbiosis with, the larger biosphere, right? I think we could all get behind that nowadays. And so through that, I decided, okay, where should I play, right? As I was choosing my career. Originally, it was communications. I was thinking maybe one day I could be a lobbyist or an advertising executive. But then I thought, okay, I'm just going to do evil for, like trying to sell things that people don't already want or sell bad ideas, right? I kind of didn't have a full framework for how that might actually support sustainability. And later on, I kind of got back into that. A very short music career, which I decided to just keep casual. And then I went to school for public administration, politics and public service. Always interested in that sort of thing and seeing how society works. Maybe you could play from the inside to change things, right? And so for a while I did. I eventually landed with the state legislative body and worked for a while up here in the state of Connecticut. It's 100 miles from New York City, 100 miles from Boston. As I was doing that, I kind of caught the clean energy bug in terms of one of the state lawmakers who I was working for. A little bit of everything, secretarial, PR, journalist, sorts of outreach. You did a little bit of everything in those roles. But I would really glom on to, renewables. I like this. Solar power, wind power, things like that. I'd be hungrily like reading articles about early days of electric vehicles, right? Whether it was like the EV1 or the Nissan Leaf or the Chevy Volt. You've got your own models over there. So that's really what got me into that. Spent maybe a year or so working for a progressive political consulting firm and headhunting firm. It never quite met each other's needs when it comes to what I was really interested in, though, which I landed at subsequently, which was the first state level green bank, mobilizing private capital toward the unlimited needs for capital inside of the clean energy economy, growing out the installations that are out there, especially on a distributed basis. Homeowners that want solar power or an electric vehicle charger or energy efficiency upgrades. So I spent maybe 7 to 8 years playing in that space as kind of a governmental go-between, flex player, that sort. And then in just the last few years, really moved to an earlier stage of what's called the technology deployment curve, right? Instead of commercialized clean energy technologies that I'm working with, I'm actually working with these brilliant entrepreneurs who have ideas, but who don't have corporations yet, right? And so I hung out my shingle for consulting and working with early stage sustainability tech firms. A lot of them are actually in Europe. I consulted, let's see, one in Africa, one Sri Lanka, UK, one over here, just a little bit of spot work. And also at the same time, I'm not trying to portray myself as an expert at anything. A lot of this journey was learning as I go, the sorts of needs and how best to fulfill them when it comes to these companies. And then about a year ago, recruited into Weather TradeNet. which is UK-based. My co-founders are in Paris and Netherlands, and I'm the gentleman in the States. And we're a scrappy and fun bunch who are playing in a very interesting space of physical climate risk, which I'll talk more about. So I went from playing on the climate mitigation side, the things that the world knows we should have been doing since the 1990s in terms of moving to clean energy, reducing emissions, things like that, to the climate adaptation and resilience side, and informing companies and communities how best to do that.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for sharing your journey. And I'm sure a lot of us here and a lot of the attendees also are trying to figure out what aspect of sustainability does resonate with them at this stage, because there are so many aspects of ESG or sustainability existing. And then how do you use your skill set and also your interest and passion to align with this domain and still make an impact on the society? So I think a lot of us got ideas and motivation from your story that you just shared. So now let's just jump to the topic of today's webinar, which is about climate risk. So I'll start with a very basic and a very fundamental question. So for a beginner in sustainability, can you explain what climate risk is and how big of a problem is it for businesses and also for societies?
So we only have an hour. Yes, and I'll number one, congratulations on the ESG series. As you could tell, we're focusing on the E, right? Both sequentially and chronologically here. So environment is what we'll be talking about today. Let me scope this in like the biggest possible terms to start out with. A lot of the attendees probably already know these things, but it's a good place to start. I found a really helpful the World Economic Forum's 2024 Global Risk Report when I read it a few months ago. Extreme weather events were placed in a survey of experts around the world. They were placed second as the greatest risk over the next couple of years, only behind artificial intelligence related disinformation. On a 10-year time horizon, the other horizon on which this global body was surveyed, the top 4 concerns turned into environmental problems. They're led by extreme weather events, number 1, and then critical change to Earth systems, biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse, natural resource shortages. So over the coming decade, and then some, you're going to be seeing that E in ESG really looming large in terms of what people are looking at the corporate sector to potentially do and adapt for. So again, large scale, humanity's breaching the carrying capacity of Earth's systems, in case you haven't noticed. This is driven by pollution, land use changes, society's emissions, changing the air chemistry of the atmosphere, right? So as a result, both the air and the oceans, they hold more potential energy, which makes the weather systems more volatile. So modern human species, I haven't been around this long, but to my knowledge, has existed for around 300,000 years. But it's only in the last 7,000 that human civilization flourished. And that's a product of environment, right? The balance that existed during much of this time, the last 6,000 to 7,000 years, is now getting thrown off, particularly starting in the 1800s, as we burn everything possible so we could power society, right? And now we're learning better about maybe that wasn't, it worked at the time, but there's side effects, right? So although you could read some long time scale Earth temperatures as like a sine wave, we aren't heating things up now from a low point in that wave. The Earth temperatures are already kind of cresting at the natural fluctuation. And so now we're pushing it up by another full interval to levels that human history hasn't seen, right? And certainly not as during the period when civilization flourished. So moving to more recent news, for the 12th consecutive month now, global temperatures they've reached 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So the pace and scale of climate change adaptation efforts, they're already falling short, right? Recall that the Paris Accord, the governments of the world, they were pledging to limit average temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius, or at least hold it below 2 degrees Celsius to limit the most catastrophic impacts of the climate change. And that was like a vision for mid-century. And so over the past year, we've been averaging at that level already. So the thresholds for large scale and actually self-perpetuating changes to planetary systems, they're already getting to be likely to exceed it. So that informs that 10-year risk assessment that we're seeing, and exceeded within the next decade. So as a species, we're well into the phase now where we're talking not just about mitigating climate change by limiting GHG emissions, but also having to adapt to it. That's my table setting effort, Chitanjali. I hope I did well.
Yes, sure. And my second question was about understanding why, like how much or how important it is for businesses to sort of understand climate risk, to work towards climate risk. And then we'll talk about the other parts of it. But as let's say, if I have a business today, why should I care about climate risk? Why should I invest money or invest my resources in predicting and anticipating and also sort of measuring the impact of climate risk?
Okay, so number one, yes, if you're a business, you should.
Yes.
But let me do a little bit further table setting because I started at such a high level right there. I didn't even describe some of the first and second order effects of what we're seeing, right? So let me get right into that. They're all headline grabbing. You read about this stuff every day. Summers without a solid North Pole ice cap, ice shelves of Greenland and Antarctica sloughing off their volume into the ocean. Every year, global sea level rises about maybe 4 millimeters, and humans like living near water. So that imperils trillions in property values over time. Erosion, mudslide, but mostly flood, exponentially worse storm surges, that sort of thing. Climate, it's what we expect, and weather, extreme weather, it's what we get. So I actually dug up a few local examples I wanted to jog my own mind with to share with you here. Just in the last month, right? Well, actually April, the UAE, the capital was flooded. The Dubai International Airport, they recorded an annual amount of rainfall in just 12 hours, right? And the maximum rate at which soil can absorb water, that's the infiltration capacity, like it might be a millimeter an hour, like if it's a compacted soil, right? And so you've got civil infrastructure shutting down entirely, which has knock-on effects in the corporate sector. Sandstorms and high temperatures over there, they might be normal conditions, but heavy rainfalls are rare on the peninsula. And so what's at risk, what society needs to assess as the risk, isn't the weather patterns that occur daily or weekly, monthly, yearly, that sort of thing. That's what's typical and expected, but those black swan emerging and surprising tendencies that maybe people haven't seen yet in a 20-year average look back, but that they're exposed to, regardless with the accelerating effects of climate change. Over here, for examples, U.S. East Coast, we see cyclones, we call them hurricanes, snow, heavy precipitation, flooding. We get rain bombs in my area. I know you're familiar over in India with the monsoon season. So is civil infrastructure appropriately armored to absorb that level of precipitation all at one time? In a lot of places it's not, and so the flooding does cause issues, property damage, business shutdowns. Hail hitting automobiles. Over there in India, you've seen some harrowing headlines. There was a recent heat wave, I think. There's one right here and right now, but a recent heat wave that was followed by heavy rain, right? So when you've got those drought conditions followed by heavy rain, then flood, right? So much of the US Southwest, Africa, Middle East, Southeast Asia are all starting to see the most perilous sort of hazard that exists for climate change is actually a little bit surprisingly emerging as heat wave, right? The Hajj, the Muslim pilgrimage with the 1,200 that perished, right? So societies, all of us, we're increasingly exposed to these environmental impacts that are kind of tough to adapt to, right? And they disrupt services. Health impacts, there's famine and disease, there's second order effects, changing the positions of rivers that leads to landslides, the health impacts of rising air temperatures that is actually compounded by humidity, the atmospheric water vapor that's out there. We can't dissipate heat quite so well. Animals can't either. Like it doesn't cool down quite so much in the overnight, right? So that's creating a high mortality rate in some places. I just read this morning in the New York Times a story from Sri Lanka. Again, I'm trying to throw the narrative over to your side of the ocean. There's epidemic evidently of late stage kidney disease emerging in 20 and 30-year-old men in fishing and farming communities. And the thinking is and that's like decades earlier and the wrong sort of profile for where you'd see it. The thinking is pesticide exposure multiplied by heat stress and chronic dehydration is probably what's causing that epidemic. So climate is fueling public health impacts at the same time. And how that affects companies and people in different places, it will matter because how much GDP, gross domestic product, can a country mobilize to address catastrophes is going to be different in different places. And over time, that threatens to undercut, maybe even reverse global economic growth, which is a bummer. Nobody wants that. So who pays? Right. When people talk to me about Weather Trade Net, they often rightly think of insurance right at the center of the bullseye. Right. Obviously, that's who's backstopping risk. But that's not necessarily always the case because they wouldn't have a business if they weren't able to at least make a margin on the policies in their risk pool. Right. And so if they're constantly paying out for catastrophes and paying the full freight of the loss, then no, that's not going to work for them. So and this is an emerging story too, they'll only write policies in areas where they can make a margin and where the premiums paid by the risk pool are greater than what gets paid out. So they'll either, if the risks increase through property related climate risks, then they'll raise their policy cost to match, triggered either when like an area's risk increases or when a policyholder files a claim. I've run into that myself. And just in recent weeks, there was news in my state, Connecticut, that half of the property insurers providing homeowner coverage, well, they're expected to boost their rates this year, at least 10% on very much related matter. So more homeowners are going to pay repair costs out of pocket so they don't have to file an insurance claim. More people are just going to forego carrying insurance because they can't afford it. Or, and this is the emerging part, insurers might just stop issuing new policies altogether in certain places. The company State Farm stopped issuing new residential policies in California. They pulled out because they had certain consumer protection laws that were well intended, but that prevented them from appropriately pricing what the future climate risk was. So that's insurance. Who else is backstopping climate risks? We could talk about government, but that is also borne by the public, right? You've got, let's see, I just learned about Flood Re over in the UK, a reinsurance scheme where the government is setting aside a few billion to back flood insurance claims. Ultimately, who's funding that? It's a rider on policyholders, right? It's either going to be tax holders or taxpayers or ratepayers that ultimately have the cost spread out. Emergency public funding, at least in the US, only tends to become available for named storms, declared disasters, and things like that. So that's the homeowner side of things. But as you were getting at, Chichanjali, there's extra considerations for affected properties when it's like commercial and industrial purposes, right? If the roads are flooded or civil infrastructure shuts down, then employees can't get to work. If wind speeds exceed safe operating thresholds, you can't move your cranes around on the skyline. Those operations cease. If heat becomes life-threatening, workers can't work or they're less productive. So there's a lot of implications for businesses, and also for credit markets, right? The lifeblood of the corporate economy. 40% on the small business side alone, after they get floods or an inundation, 40% don't reopen. Right? They just can't afford it. Another 25% fail within a year. Homeowners, going back to them, they might struggle to pay their mortgages afterward, especially without a special flood rider insurance. So there's financial shocks. And then the global domino effect of a supply chain. What happens during large scale disruptions? If electronic chips or car components can't be shipped in time or they're stuck in a port. This actually happened last year in the Panama Canal due to severe drought. The traffic was heavily restricted. Lack of rainfall, El Nino in the Pacific, the second driest event in 70 years down in Central America, right? So maritime traffic disruption, it led to all this ship congestion, delays, and operational costs. And it was estimated that the supply chain interruptions related just to that was $270 billion just for a drought in Central America. And there's an indirect economic cost that naturally follows on from that in terms of the global supply chain, the small to medium enterprises who kind of go bankrupt in silence because their shipment never arrives, right? That sort of thing. So that's that side of the thing. I could take a breath, and now I think I'm about ready to address what you were getting at. But let me let you jump in if you want to jump in first.
Sure. Thank you, Matt. I think you covered not just the manifestations of climate risk, like how are we seeing it around us in our day-to-day life, but also the implications for climate risk on different kinds of industries, like insurance, property owners, businesses, even individuals, like in our day-to-day life as homeowners, as buyers. How does it impact our our lives, our financial statements? So it basically, climate risk comes closer to us, like it comes closer at home to us, and we sort of relate to it more. And the reason for asking this question was because when I speak to a lot of, especially small and medium enterprises, and I'm taking the context of India right now, when you talk to them about climate risk and tell them, okay, you should assess your risk, you should develop strategies and design strategies to mitigate these risks. Um, the first question, or maybe like the only question that comes up, is that how does it affect our revenue? How does it affect our profits? And because they have limited resources, limited financial and human resources, why should we invest that resource in assessing and mitigating climate risk, and not sort of focus on increasing our manufacturing capacity or enhancing our supply chain, etc., etc. And it takes a while to sort of explain them, and that happens through a lot of case studies that we do. That a simple flood event or unexpected flood event in a part of India, in a town of India, where this company has their logistics warehouse, if that flood occurs without sort of preparation and the company is not prepared to handle that amount of water, it leads to disruptions in the supply chain, which impacts their finances in a lot many ways. So it's not only impacting the time it's taking to reach the consumers, and especially if it's a perishable item, which if it gets delayed by 2 days, it just gets spoiled and it's of no use to the consumers or to the buyers. So it's basically a very it looks intuitive that it's somewhat any company should be able to understand it, but to make a company understand that a particular risk, if you don't anticipate and measure it, can lead to so many losses, not just in the short term but also in the long term. It takes a while, and I'm talking about it as a consultant because we uh, handle those questions almost every day, that why is it important for us. So I think you very aptly covered it, and you captured, I think, almost every industry that we are looking at. So
Really
now
is.
I'll just move on. Yeah.
No, I
Yeah.
was going to say it really is every industry, and that's the tough part about this. I
Yeah.
mean, it's agriculture,
Exactly.
obviously, like forestry, nature preservation markets, crop yields, anyone in the value chain, like shipping or the hedge funds that trade those commodities, mining, hospitality and recreation, any business that relies on foot traffic, right? Anyone with non-diversified supply chains or whose property is tied to the productivity or uptime of that property or plant, right? And you said, Trichanjali, what gets measured gets managed, right? And so if you'll indulge me, I actually want to talk a little about India. So recognizing that the corporate sector is getting seen, especially in the last decade, as both a kind of cause and solution for climate change and adaptation. Governments and central banks, they've begun promulgating ESG disclosure requirements, right? So particularly, these affect large and listed companies who get most directly regulated. Do you mind if I set the table real quick on this? Okay, because this really relates to what's driving the market for whether TradeNet's sort of ESG solution when it comes to physical climate risk. So around like 2015, 2017, the G20 group of nations and their Financial Stability Board, they started creating a reporting framework through the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. There's this whole alphabet soup I'm not going to get into of international corporate accounting bodies who've integrated that framework, including the International Sustainability Standards Board. In the last few years, governments have been adopting these standards. Just this week, Ireland and Sweden were the latest ones. And all the EU member states, they're already obliged through their corporate sustainability reporting disclosures agreement. With India, I did a little homework here in preparation for the webinar. They've emerged as being pretty conscientious about this too, in combating climate change and in meeting sustainable development goals and its regulatory schemes. So an early version of ESG reporting, my understanding is, began in 2012 as business responsibility reporting on the top 100 listed companies over there. It started voluntarily in 2009. And that was the platform that they built upon later. Last year, the business responsibility and sustainability report framework emerged in India, intended to be interoperable with the international frameworks and expanded to the top 1,000 listed companies, and with a broader scope of reporting, a whole sweep of ESG factors relating to integrity, sustainability, well-being, stakeholder engagement, human rights, transparency, that sort of thing. So India has recently been implementing these, and as of this year, started really honing its focus on physical climate risks. The Reserve Bank of India, who care about the solvency of corporates and all the investor community, they released the draft disclosure framework on climate-related financial risks, which appears to be taking the international board's framework and vetting them locally for applicability. So that would apply to commercial banks and to, let's say, the top tier corporates, like large and listed companies. So that quick bullet list requires who's responsible for oversight of climate-related issues, how they factor into strategy setting, what climate-related issues are reasonably material to their business model and their revenues, and how they intend to respond to it. It's not just how a company intends to respond to the impacts of climate change, but also their contribution to it. So in a lot of these regulatory schemes, we're also seeing companies having to disclose their target setting for GHG emissions and avoidance, and under the proposed enhanced standards in India, exactly what those emissions are. So you're making moves over there, we're making moves over here. And that's kind of the landscape that we're finding ourselves in for weather trade net solution for physical climate risk reporting for corporates.
Thank you, Matt. And coming to that that part of the conversation, what industries or types of companies do you think should be most worried about physical climate risk? And what advice would you give to these companies to how, like, just starting to assess their climate risk?
So we covered a number of examples, right? It's sector agnostic. There's those who are more obviously impacted, like agriculture, anything outdoor, anything related to nature, supply chain, business uptime on their property or plants, that sort of thing. Even like diligence companies for mergers and acquisitions, anyone with a long holding position on property or its investment, right? Or just with a nexus to its operation. So that's pretty broad. And then those who are especially concerned about it would, of course, be the companies who are now starting to get regulatorily exposed to these reporting standards. A lot of these are kicking in 2024, 25, 26 in various countries. We expect 80 plus countries by the end of this year to have enacted reporting standards on mostly their large and listed corporations. So that's a big chunk of the global economy. And even if you're not headquartered in one of those countries, let's say we're talking about, we have a network of states over here, as you do too. California passed the most assertive law so far. They're the biggest economy. And let's say your headquarters is here in Connecticut. If you do a substantial enough amount of business in California, well, then you have to report in on the same, right? So it's anyone who also does a substantial amount of business in some of these economies too. So what do we do in order to help? The corporate risk managers, it's not just the sustainability leads for each of these companies. It's the corporate risk managers who really want to know, how does this affect the balance sheet and the fiscal forecast? So they're going to want to know what facilities, what factories, what real estate assets are exposed to major climate perils and surprises. And what are those climate perils? They might want to know it on a site-by-site basis, not just the full portfolio average, although the regulations might just compel one versus the other. They're going to want to go deeper. So is it flood, storm, wildfire, drought, landslide, that sort of thing? And where is the action most urgent? Assigning the right priority is critical. And so it matters if you've got one property that might have severe wildfire risk in a decade's time, where it might be almost uninsurable, versus one where sea level rise is going to hit it particularly hard in 30 years, right? You need to know where the adaptation and resilience investments need to be mobilized first and in what order. So we transform this ocean of hourly weather records that are out there into climate risk metrics that make sense. And it's a scientific exercise. It helps to understand and manage the impacts of those sorts of hazards by leveraging detailed meteorological data, statistical analysis, and climate modeling, kind of digital twins of the earth, for those sorts of actionable insights. There's static global climate models that do exist out there. They might get rebooted once every 5 years, kind of adopted by the ITCC as the best and latest and greatest, but they're snapshots in time, right? And so as the years roll by and more weather observations are recorded, they need to be de-biased so that they're reconciled to reality, those static snapshots. So we perform that sort of an exercise on the scientific data, grid it appropriately. A flood matters particularly at this grid resolution, where let's say 100 meters, right? You're going to want to know if your side of the street is flooded. If there's a wildfire within 100 kilometers, you're probably going to want to know because the air quality will be so bad you can't operate. So the range of the pixel matters, so to speak, when it comes to each of these reporting metrics. So we provide those sorts of risk metrics for millions of addresses worldwide, not on top of a mountain, not at the bottom of the ocean, and not in Antarctica, but anywhere else that this form of data is collected on Earth, we can provide those sorts of risk scores, both acute and chronic. So let's say one-day events versus long-term events, with forward looking predictive warming pathway the Earth takes. So it doesn't take a long time to do it. We created a platform that allows for an upload of latitude, longitude coordinates or addresses, and out comes the risk metrics report. It's relatively instantaneous and really geared in advance for that corporate compliance purpose, where they're going to want to know this relatively quickly. So we take long time series historical records and future projections, collide them together to provide those probability and severity metrics extended out to 2030, 2040, and 2050. So regulatory compliance, materiality assessments, new investments like real estate, construction, or agriculture, or just corporate risk management for planning resilience actions. These could all be very helpful for that sort of thing. That's the risk metric side when it comes to scoring these on kind of an insurance logic of no risk to uninsurable. So an executive decision maker can quickly get a sense of things. But then lastly, each type of climate hazard has a sort of bundle of indicators that are tied to it. A likelihood of something breaching a certain threshold, right? What counts as a 10-year versus 100-year versus 1,000-year storm? So for cyclones, maybe that's surf height or cumulative wind speed, that sort of thing. Floods, frequency, severity, rainfall intensity, wet days to the X percentile, that sort. Change in days with high wildfire potential, what's the delta between two time periods? And as I was talking before, heat stress, a big one lately. What are the number of extreme heat days, maximum temperature, the change in energy demand? Those sorts of indicators can be assessed on a forward-looking basis as well. And we do get those sorts of requests too. So that's what we provide. Quick and easy way to scan a set of properties, whether it's 5 or 5,000 at a time, for the hotspots.
And what is the right time in any company's journey, sustainability journey, for them to contact Weather TradeNet?
So it would be malpractice if I didn't say right now, right? But it also depends on what their size is, their strategy, their capacity. Did they allocate a budget for their sustainability department or their risk department for the assessment of forward-looking climate change, right? And a lot of them are learning to do that now, if they're not already, because of these new requirements. For the SMEs, the small business side of things, we have free or low-cost trial products that give a snapshot of risk at a high level for their property portfolio. The free product, actually, you could demo this right here. It's yourclimaterisk.com. It just maps to your IP address and tells you what's your worst risk now and in 10 years' time. For the more regulated corporates or for the more mainline customers we have, it kind of depends, in large part, since it's driven by regulations on which fiscal or calendar year the reporting requirement kicks in, and do they want to pre-stage their operations so they can get used to reporting in advance, seeing where their gaps are in terms of data and in terms of need. Again, in many economies, 2024, 25, 26. So we're expecting kind of a hockey stick of activity when it comes to people seeking out climate risk providers for analytics. So yeah, anytime makes sense, and especially anytime works to start a conversation. There's an practically, I don't want to say limitless. I just don't have a number in front of me, but there's a lot of sustainability consulting companies out there, right? Or ESG provider companies. Some of them, they all do great work. They're doing the Lord's work, but a lot of them don't have climate risk modules yet, right? Because it's highly specialized and it's kind of emergent. Whereas emissions tracking, energy efficiency, other such things, those have been kind of in the mainstream consciousness for longer. And so what we're looking for, if anyone's listening, we always like partnerships with sustainability companies. Those could be very fruitful in terms of just white labeling through API our sort of climate scientific risk data. So yeah, that's my plug.
And one last question before we open the floor for audience to ask the questions is that, let's say if a company has started their journey, they have sort of begun their journey in climate risk assessments. Now, how do they integrate this result into their sustainability strategy? Can you give an example of how businesses can do that? Because, okay, fine, if I know, let's say as a business, that these are the 5 areas of climate risk my business is susceptible or vulnerable to, and this is the impact it's going to cause, etc., etc. Now, what's next for me as a business?
Great question. So we provide kind of the first order effects, right? The physical climate risk, and that's our specialty. There's also that econometric analysis, transition risk analysis in terms of how will they adapt to that. So there's the economic forecasting component. They may have that sort of talent in-house. We could be commissioned to that or junctioned onto a team where there's others we could handhold you to in terms of running that sort of social and economic impact analysis where they're allocating investments and priorities. That's going to be an internal company matter. So how they weight the importance of their properties and what economic value is tied to those, that's something that each company is going to have that they don't necessarily need to give to the data provider. But that would follow in terms of that assessment. I'm taking 2 directions with that. So running the economic impact analysis. Again, they can come to us or others for a deeper dive once they see where the red flags are. Okay, tell us a lot more about what's going to happen on that exact property in the future, right? There's also the geotechnical and engineering sort of concerns, which we certainly don't do on our side, and that's talking to firms who have specialty in resilience and adaptation measures. Bioswales, dikes, berms, controlled burns for wildfires, whatever that happens to look like in terms of the civil or corporate action that would have to be taken to buffer against that anticipated effect of climate risk. Those sorts of geotechnical analyses would be commissioned in order to inform them as to where their future adaptation investments should be placed. Yeah, I guess that's where I take that.
Sure. Okay. And thank you, Matt, for answering all those questions that I'd asked you. Now I'll open the floor for the attendees. If you have any question for Matt, you can put it in the chat box or ask me to unmute you or and ask directly. Let me open the question answers.
Why does Matt have a neon dinosaur attached to the wall behind him?
Okay, I'll unmute you. Okay. Hi, Priya.
Am I audible?
Yes. Hi, Priya.
Hi. It was very interesting, actually. So it has been a while since I've been working on climate change in businesses. I just want you to ask one question, since you already know that we have shifted. India has shifted from BRR to BRSR reporting, like from voluntary to a mandatory thing now. But certain regulations, like we also have mandatory CSR within our Companies Act of 2013. But what has been happening over the years in India, at least, the annual reports, if you see, because it's in the public domain. So the companies, they forge the data. I mean, like they put in, lively numbers and whatnot in good graphics that we are putting so much effort into climate change and towards climate action. But on the contrary, in reality, they are the ones who are polluting the most. So, like the local communities or the environment are the one that have negative consequences because of their establishment, because of their operations, because EIA procedure or the precautionary measures are not taken care of by the industries. So do you think like imposing too much of regulations on businesses without involving them puts us at a great risk of consequences like, say, greenwashing, rather than including them in the conversation? Do you think like it's better to have some people voice out the opinion of the industries or the businesses while the government frames a policy for them to cater to in the future? Or do you think that the processes or the regulations that are going on right now is going in the right direction? I hope my question was clear. It's a bit complicated, I think, because
Does that, and that's a great question, and I'm glad you didn't ask me about more specifics on India's regulatory transition,
it's a
because some of
general
you might
question.
actually know better than me. So in the ESG conversation, stakeholder consultation does tend to come up as a cornerstone, but it tends to be more like disadvantaged and affected communities, indigenous communities, that sort of thing. It's not the corporates, but that naturally does tend to be a source of consultation effort, in part because you can't craft an effective implementable law without their sort of input. And in all the instances that I've observed, there have been lengthy comment periods on draft rules made available. Now, to what extent the regulators integrate corporate concerns remains to be seen. But in some of those that I browse through, they're well informed about what they can do and what they can't do. You make an excellent point about greenwashing as the devilish alternative, right? In terms of just checkbox compliance, but they're doing something else. I think that no regulation is not the answer, because that hasn't necessarily been an effective approach. Their natural profit and rent-seeking incentive is just going to direct them in a certain direction that is not the public interest, right? It's the shareholder interest. So there is a need for regulation. I don't think it's either or, because in most of these cases, the regulators or the governments or central banks, they'll get attacked by the corporate sector, and there'll be the op-eds in the newspapers and things like that, indicating, oh, we were never consulted. So like, this is an unrealistic sort of thing. Oftentimes there are comment periods, but what's a matter of flux is to what degree were those sorts of comments integrated, and are they considered realistic by, let's say, the professional scientific staff or academia, who is making the arguments on the other side, right? Is it well intended by the sustainability staff, or is it, I don't want to use a broad brush painting them, but is it coming from their lawyers, right? And just trying to limit their exposure very naturally to any sort of new regulatory requirement, which is naturally what the attorneys will try to do for the companies. And I think that it'll be a mixed bag. I don't have a clear answer to your question. I'll just compliment it as a good question.
Yeah, thank you. It's actually a very complicated question. I just have been struggling through it for days now, because I've been reading, but there's no clear answer to that. But I have been working towards this government business coordination, and looks like it's a far-fetched idea. However, probably seems to be the right direction to go through. I don't know, maybe in some years to come.
I think that on the extreme side of things, look to like the U.S. oil majors. Like the European ones behave a little better. The U.S. oil majors have kind of obfuscated and masked the climate change impact. They run PR campaigns for decades, indicating confusion around the issue and trying to slow action. And now they've got exposure legally in certain jurisdictions, and with a growing number of suits being tested against them, especially from the generation of youth, bringing class action, saying, we know you did this and you're impacting our future. And in some cases being successful. I guarantee you, there's probably boardrooms with terrified people in them at times, given that they might have unlimited downside exposure to having to pay the cost at some point in the future and losing their social and civic mandate to be able to be a corporation at some point in time. I'm forecasting here. That hasn't happened yet, but I think that is a potential direction that the baddest actors in the climate space probably feel as the evidence continues piling up in terms of the effects of climate change.
Yeah, right. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thanks, Matt. I think we have someone raising their hands. I'll just unmute them. Yeah. Hi. Hi, Modi. Can you hear us? I've unmuted you. You can go ahead and ask a question.
Hi, Matt Macunas here. So you mentioned that you are mentoring some tech startups. So I just want to understand, with the arrival of AI, what are the changes that you see in the trends? Like, I hope it's a positive impact, but what are the changes or trends that you see with AI in this space?
So talk about disruptive, right? Yeah, number one, I think it's funny musing on the idea of, like, every time ChatGPT upgrades to a new model, you might have broken the business models of numerous startups who are using it as a backbone, right? Everyone's trying to build AI into their systems, and lots of startups, they put in their pitch decks, regardless of to what extent AI is actually integrated in there. There is predictive modeling that we use on our side. There's some generative content that we've been experimenting with on our side. There's a lot of potential business models, and it's wide open when it comes to that space. I feel like the recent Y Combinator cohort probably had a very large portion of its cohort dedicated just to building on AI tools. You're going to see that in the foreseeable future as the main focus area of tech startups. Beyond anything else, whether, going back to the greenwashing conversation, they're just saying that, or if, I think in a lot of cases, it actually will be integrated into their product or operations in some novel way, or just reskinning an existing tool and bringing it to the masses. I mean, there's a number of different business models that one could write around that sort of thing. And there's more educated actors who could opine on that. But yeah, I hope I answered some of that question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Matt.
Sure.
Thank you for asking that question, Modi. Anyone else wants to ask a question? You can raise your hand or put it in the chat box. Okay.
Oh, I should.
Okay, there's one. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
I was about to give the last word. Don't forget to go to our website, weathertrade.net. Okay. Next question.
You can leave a link here as well, Matt. Do you want me to put a link here? Just okay. So just one last question I think we have here from the audience. What is the most surprising insight you have gained from working in the field of climate risk analytics?
I gotta love and hate those questions at the same time, right? Or you pick favorites. How could you pick a favorite child? So the most surprising insight. Oftentimes the ones that are most surprising are the concrete anecdotes or parables, like hearing about, the Panama Canal, that sort of thing, where there's just something very specific, right? But these stories are emerging like every single day in the newspapers, right? So there's no one thing. Climate analytics, oof, I love that question. And I wish I was prepared to cite it, because I know I've cited before to some of my colleagues that, hey, you guys, this is the most surprising thing I've learned. But in terms of retrieving that knowledge right now, just let me be diplomatic. How much talent is out there in the scientific, the activist communities, even in the staffs of many companies and corporate consultants and audit firms, the number of well-meaning people who see, as we do, as we were kind of table setting at the front end, the need for sustainability and climate change to be integrated into the operations of human society as its DNA, just as a matter of continuity for the success of human civilization, right? And everyone doing their own part, confident that no matter how small, they can move that inertial mass of humanity in the right direction.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Matt. And I'll also leave a link to your, do you want to leave your contact, like email or LinkedIn, for people? Yeah.
There's my email, and let me
Okay.
leave my LinkedIn as well. I'm pleased to accept connections. Please do.
Okay. All right. So we have reached 7:30, the time for the webinar to end. And thank you, Matt, for joining us and sharing all those wonderful insights, and also sharing your experience from over the years in sustainability and climate risk. So we look forward to speaking with you again in the future. And yeah, thank you so much once again.
Thanks
Have
for
a good
having me,
day.
Gitanjali, and for letting me start my day with the end of yours. I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you so much. Have a good day. Bye. Thank you, everyone, for joining.